Hi there, good evening, and welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, find us at jimbotalk.net, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jimbo Talks. Ronald Reagan left the presidency January 20th of 1989. Hard to believe that it's been that long ago, almost 27 years ago. Ever since that time, the Republican Party's been trying to find another Reagan, a next Reagan. His impact, of course, on the country and the world was considerable. His time in office has been widely written about, but joining us this evening is a man who can be said to be a definitive biographer of our 40th president, Craig Shirley, who makes a return visit to talk about his third book on the late president, Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. It's published by Thomas Nelson. It covers the rarely talked about last years of Reagan's life, which came to be dominated by his diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and the quiet dignity of the man and his wife as that disease progressed. And I can remember vividly, of course, the phrase used by Nancy Reagan, the long goodbye. Craig Shirley, thank you for being back on our program tonight.
You bet, Jim. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and very curious about this. Obviously, those final years have I think not been given the attention that they deserve, and I'm glad to see that you have been the person to step in and try to fill this out. That term, long goodbye, very poignant. I can remember my own mother's battle with dementia in her final years. She would send me a letter that I would receive just about every Tuesday, a letter a week. And I talked to her on the phone occasionally, but, I'd read the letter on Tuesday, and if I didn't, Wednesday maybe, if something was a little late. If I hadn't gotten the letter by Thursday, then I would bring it up in one of our phone calls. And I remember at one point, I did, in fact, bring it up on a Thursday, and she said that she hadn't gotten around to it. Well, it turned out that letter, the previous week, was the last letter I ever got from her. That particular synapse in her brain had been the next to go. There were no more letters. And it is, as Nancy Reagan put it, the long goodbye. Every day a little piece of that person you love disappears. Sometimes it's noticeable, sometimes it's not. I'm wondering, as you put together the book Last Act, what were the first clues for either Nancy Reagan or, for that matter, Ronald Reagan or others around him that perhaps this was to be his fate?
Well, that was a very poignant story about your mother, and I think that Nancy Reagan and the immediate family went through the same thing with Ronald Reagan. The reason I wrote the book was because, people forget that he lived for 16 years after he was in the White House, and there was a lot of living that went on in those 16 years. There were a lot of speeches, and there were a lot of events and a lot of policy positions and a lot of travel. He was knighted. He built a presidential library. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth. So there was a lot of activity, and there was he met with Gorbachev 3-4 more times. When he left the White House in January of 1989, he was just, by all accounts, by the accounts of his aides, by his diary, by his writings, everything else, he was as mentally agile and fit and fiddle as he was when he entered in January of 1981. It was only in probably late 1993, early 1994, when he first started showing signs. He and Nancy went to the Mayo Clinic every year for years to be tested, both physically and psychologically. And every year he passed with flying colors. And the psychological tests consisted of, number sequences and color sequences and other memory tests and things like that. And it was only until 1994 that the spring of 1994, when he went to Mayo, that he started showing early signs of what they called age-appropriate, more than age-appropriate forgetfulness, and then was later diagnosed with the Alzheimer's.
So, based on what you put together, there is no indication that this terrible disease had even begun. And of course, it's a very gradual process in the beginning, so no one can ever nail down for sure exactly when it starts. But you're saying that there was no evidence from aides or friends or family that during his time in the White House, which is to say right up to January 20th of 1989, when he was the leader of the free world, the man with the finger on the button, at no time prior to that was there evidence that dementia had begun?
No. You know, in some ways, too, Jim, is that the second term is underreported, and it's something that needs to be investigated. Maybe I should do a book on the second term, because in some ways the second term was more productive than the first term, because he enacted sweeping tax reform, and that's the last time we've had tax reform in this country. It's been over 30 years. He enacted a missile deal, the first time in history where there was actually a reduction in U.S. and Soviet nuclear arms since the advent of the Cold War. There were a lot of other things. There were a lot of important speeches, but in many ways, of course, there was distractions too. There was Iran-Contra and other things like that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that distraction, because usually any discussion of Reagan's second term, and let's face it, presidential second terms as a rule are not as good as the first term. But Iran-Contra was certainly the headline of that second term. Yeah,
and it's unfortunate too, because it overshadows so much of the other good things that took place in the second term. You know, just from the standpoint of the economy alone, the economy was booming in the second term. Millions of jobs were being created. Gasoline actually dropped to less than $1 a gallon. Unemployment when he left office in January of 1989 was 5.4%. Which some economists said was impossible. And inflation had been eradicated. Interest rates had been, reduced to a very, supportable level. So there was still a lot of good things going on. But there's no doubt Iran-Contra is a blemish, and it's a black eye on the part of the second term.
Yeah.
But he. I think he was able to handle it well. He appointed the Tower Commission. Lawrence Walsh issued his final report, and the final report said that Reagan had no idea of the arms for hostages, thing that was implicated by, or not implicated, but put together by Oliver North. And so he was exonerated from that. So I think when you take the balance of Reagan, Iran-Contra tends to fade now.
Although, of course, many have used that, of course, as proof that he was, in fact, too detached from the presidency, the opposite of his predecessor, the ultimate presidential nitpicker, Jimmy Carter, who actually was the man who scheduled who got to use the White House tennis courts.
Right, yes, exactly.
But beyond that, I mean, I concurred with Oliver North when he testified about that taking this money from Iran and using it to support the Contras was, quote, a neat idea. I agreed with him right up to the part about it being in violation of the law, even though the Boland Amendment, in my view, was a truly brain-dead, stupid law. But even stupid laws
it's probably unconstitutional, too, as far as limiting a president's war-making ability and his president's ability to conduct foreign policy.
Of course, the other side of that coin would be the fact that we haven't had a declared war since December 8th of 1941, and that maybe that would be excessive power granted to presidents, including the War Powers Act, which I've heard some describe as unconstitutionally granting authority to the president that is reserved for Congress and their right under the Constitution to declare wars.
Right.
Yeah. We're going to come back and talk some more about this. Craig Shirley, our guest, and again, the book Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan is published by Thomas Nelson. Thanks for being with us on the Jim Bohannon Show tonight as we're looking back on a man who had tremendous impact on this world. No question about that. There have been many who have disparaged the memory of Ronald Reagan. I know people who to this day still grit their teeth about Reagan National Airport, which has always prompted a very serious get over it from me, but there are certainly such people out there. Craig Shirley is our guest, the founder, president, and CEO of Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs, the influential government relations and marketing firm. He's written for the Washington Post, Politico, the Los Angeles Times, and the Weekly Standard, among other publications. He's been named the first Reagan Scholar at Eureka College in Eureka, Illinois, which, by the way, is Ronald Reagan's alma mater. And he taught a course there titled Reagan 101. Just as an aside, when we look at Ronald Reagan's legacy, and certainly the fact that he continues to cast a considerable shadow over the Republican presidential field even today, I wonder whether or not Ronald Reagan could win a Republican nomination today, and I wonder that not based on of course, the memory of the Gipper and two sweeping election victories and presiding over the efforts that led to this dismantling of the Soviet Union and all the rest of it. No, I'm talking about the guy who was the candidate who first ran, has been actor, pretty glib, giving speeches, governor of California for a while, probably, although I think, if I'm not mistaken, taxes went up, I think, in California during his time there, and I've heard some say that he gave a lot more lip service and actual backing to social conservatives. I seriously wonder, Craig, if that Ronald Reagan, before he became the giant of the Republican Party, could he win a Republican nomination today? Would he be conservative enough?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I've thought about this a lot. You know, one thing is for certain is Reagan changed the Republican Party in the same way that Abraham Lincoln changed the Republican Party, and in the same way that Theodore Roosevelt changed the Republican Party. He literally remade the Republican Party into a conservative governing force with a dose of libertarianism, a high degree placed on the future and optimism, really an enlightened type of conservatism which we hadn't seen before in many ways. So I like to think that because he did so then, he would do so again, because the force of his personality was so strong. He was able to convince people. He always believed that if he had a microphone and an audience, he could convince his audience to the righteousness of his positions.
And he was probably right more often than not.
Yeah, well, just one example is the Panama Canal treaties. When they've been hotly debated in the United States off and on for over the years. It first been proposed, I think, under Franklin Roosevelt, that transfer of the canal be turned over to the Panamanian government, and of course it faded with World War II. It came up again during the Johnson administration, then faded with the Cold War, and then of course it came up in the 1970s. And as you recall, it was the only thing everybody in America was talking about for a long time. And when it was first seriously proposed, a majority of the American people supported the transfer of the authority of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian government. By the time Reagan took on a one-man crusade, he testified before Congress. He led a Panama Canal Truth Squad across the country. He wrote columns. He did radio commentaries. He gave speeches, and he literally changed the opinion of the American people. So by the time of the passage in March of 1978 of the treaties, a majority of the people actually opposed them. So I think that was evidence, pretty good evidence, that he could convince people of the righteousness of his positions.
You spent a fair amount of time in this book, Final Act, looking at the Ronald and Nancy Reagan relationship. Of course, he remains the only divorced president, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But this, let's put it this way: there's every indication that these two individuals got it right the second time around.
I think so, and his divorce from Jane Wyman was not something that he wanted, and it really bothered him very, very deeply for a long time. But he married Nancy. Their marriage, their '53 marriage, was truly one of the great stories of the White House and the American presidency, because these people truly, truly were in love with each other. Stu Spencer, who was a longtime aide to Reagan, told me once that he was going to the L.A. train station with Reagan. They're making a short political trip, and Nancy drove him to the airport, and she walked him inside, and the two of them embraced. The sky cabs are coming and going. The newspaper boys are coming and going. Businessmen are coming and going, and the two of them are there embracing as if nobody else in the world existed, if they were just the only two people. He said it was one of the most remarkable acts of love that he'd ever seen.
Tell us something about the two of them that the rest of us don't know.
Well, she didn't like the ranch when he first bought it. He needed the ranch. He'd had one in Malibu. He had one in someplace else in California, but he really needed it. He bought it the last year of his governorship, and she didn't. It was a harrowing, one way road up several miles. Straight drops of several hundreds of feet cliff, and very secluded, over 600 acres high, atop the I always get that wrong, in his mountains. And it was very, very secluded. And she didn't like it, but she grew to actually love it very much because it was one of the few places in the world where she could have him to herself. So I think that was one great story. I think also is that people don't realize is that for the 10 years he suffered with the Alzheimer's, we'd talk about it, we'd move on. The world gradually, moved on from Ronald Reagan as far as thinking of him as an active political leader or whatever. But she lived with it day in and day out, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never complained, never whined, never, did anything other than care for him lovingly, tenderly, and protecting his dignity all at the same time.
There is a story told about at one point, and you don't hear stories of the Reagan temper, but the story was that at the ranch, at one point, Ronald Reagan became enraged about something and ripped a phone off the wall.
I've heard that. There was Reagan had a temper. There's no doubt about it. He didn't. A friend of his once said that Reagan's temper was like magnesium. It flared very, very, very hot and very brightly for a second, and then it passed. And so he would occasionally throw his glasses or break a pencil or something else like that. One time, when aide Mike Deaver was telling him about Spiro Agnew's resignation, he had his keys in his hand. He threw them right in Deaver's chest. He was so mad about it. He wasn't mad at Deaver. He was just mad at Agnew and mad at Agnew for embarrassing the Republican Party. So he had a temper.
Wow. I want to get to the funeral in a moment, but I'm wondering about this in terms of the Nancy and Ronald relationship. They were very close personally. To what extent did she influence policy? Of course, we've often heard about the partnership. You get two for the price of one, Bill and Hillary, back in 1992. Did she have an overt impact on policy? We're told she had quite an impact on personnel, for example. I think she was responsible for Donald Reagan being removed from the White House staff.
Well, that was bound to happen. The great campaign biographer Teddy White once said that the Reagan Central Command meets in bed every night. And there's no doubt she was a strong, powerful, a woman who was, had her own opinions, but she never involved herself in policy, and there's never any evidence whatsoever she involved herself in policy. She did care for for her husband and looked out for him, and he for her. And I think that's just evidence of a very good, strong, trusting marriage. So, but the idea that she affected policy or that she didn't go to cabinet meetings like Rosalind Carter or give her husband advice on tax policy or missile policy or the Cold War or anything else like that. If he had asked her, he would have listened to her. But there's no evidence that he really consulted her about those things.
Fair enough. More to come. Craig Shirley, our guest, as we take a look at Last Act, a great Ronald Reagan story in a moment.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
arguably one of the great political advertisements of all time, that from the 1984 Reagan re-election effort, which of course saw him lose only the District of Columbia and Walter Mondale's home state of Minnesota, the latter just barely. Craig Shirley is our guest, and he's here to talk about his book, Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan, published by Thomas Nelson. Certainly one part of this book that must be covered would be the Reagan funeral. I just want to quote from the book. Slowly, the funeral procession made its way to Capitol Hill, past hundreds of thousands of Americans. It was followed by a lone soldier carrying the flag of the commander-in-chief, a blue field with a circle of 50 stars and the seal of the American president. The silence was astonishing. There was no breeze and little sound from the crowd either. All that could be heard was the clomp, clomp, clomp of the horses and the creaking of the wooden wheels on the carriage, the soft sound of drums. Tell us more about that. It was certainly a dramatic moment, right up there, I would have to say, frankly, with the funerals of John Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. This was, of course, now, presidents, have different type funerals. Some presidents have state funerals, others have private funerals. Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan all had state funerals, and that's governed by the Military District of Washington. They go to a president very early in his administration. They basically say, Mr. President, do you want a state funeral or you want a private funeral? And they'll tell them. And if it's a private funeral, then they'll just excuse themselves and wish him luck. And if it's a state funeral, then they take control of it, and everything is set, lying in the rotunda, National Day of Mourning, other things like that, the full involvement of the federal government, especially the U.S. military. And Reagan had wanted a state funeral, so the planning had begun very early in his administration and grew over the years, who would speak and where it would be and all that. But what was unplanned and unexpected was the astonishing turnout of the American people, both in Simi Valley and in Washington, D.C. You'd have to go back, really, as you mentioned, to Jim, to FDR and JFK for the tremendous outpouring of the American people. And what was especially hard was it was a very, very hot and humid week in Washington, and a lot of people were passing out, and bottles of water were passed out, and still for the 36 hours he lay in state in the rotunda. Well over 100,000 people passed his beer.
Just a truly remarkable thing. And again, consider that this is in a city that is overwhelmingly Democratic.
Yes. Well, people came from all over the country. I detailed people who got in planes in Atlanta and Nashville, and people who drove from Syracuse, New York, and Bangor, Maine. There were license plates from all the states seen lining the streets of Washington for the days he was here.
And there were so many details of this funeral that were just right. For example, the riding boots facing backward in the stirrups of the riderless horse were, in fact, Reagan's own well-worn personal riding boots. Right? Yes,
yeah. And it was interesting too, because they were inadvertently buffed up. He'd had them at the ranch, and then they were at the library, the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, and just as he had worn them the last time, and they were scuffed up and still had a little mud on them, things like that. And somebody got the bright idea, well, we better clean these up, and they were put in the boots, the stirrups backward, and there were some complaints made because the president's boots looked too new.
Nonetheless, you can't please everybody.
Yeah, right.
Did Nancy plan the funeral?
Yes, she did, and so did President Reagan himself. They joked. They kept having to select new pallbearers because the pallbearers they kept selecting kept dying on them. But they selected the 5 pallbearers, and then they selected the speakers, and it was going to be Margaret Thatcher without a doubt. It was going to be Brian Mulroney without a doubt. It was going to be former President George Bush without a doubt, and the sitting president of the United States, who at the time just happened to be George W. Bush. Bill Clinton squawked a lot about that and made basically a nuisance of himself. He kept, going through intermediaries to, get Nancy to allow him to speak at the funeral, citing bipartisanship. But it was just a, coincidence that the two of the speakers were former Republican presidents. But there was no way that Nancy Reagan was going to allow Bill Clinton to speak at her husband's funeral. There was no love lost between the two, especially after when Clinton ran for re-election in 1996, he ran TV commercials that included footage of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. And Mrs. Reagan called the White House twice, asking that what she thought was tasteless commercials be taken off the air, and her phone calls were never returned.
Wow. More to come. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll take a look at the Reagan legacy in terms of what he did when he was Reagan and how his life dwindled out under the impact of Alzheimer's disease. Craig Shirley is our guest, who has written a remarkable story. And of all the things written about Reagan, much of this has not been written. We'll also take a look at another book out there with which Craig Shirley takes some issues. Thanks for being with us on the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Craig Shirley, our guest, has put together quite a look at the man that he got to know quite well. Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. It's published by Thomas Nelson. And as we again prepare to choose a president, it's interesting to note that still Reagan is the prism through which many will be judged for that august office. Let's just start with a few of the slanders that have been tossed at Reagan over the years. Has-been actor, intellectual lightweight, too detached, let others do the detail work, and that led to Iran-Contra, lacking compassion. He was a skinflint conservative. Have I hit most of them?
You just scratch the surface, as a matter of fact.
Okay, go ahead and take this as batting practice, Craig, and knock that out of the park.
Well, I mean, he was called the Teflon president, but that was meant as a term of derision. He was a lightweight. He was, Gerald Ford once said that Ronald Reagan isn't going gray, he's just turning prematurely orange, his hair. It went on and on and on. His movie career was derided, his acting skills, his looks, the wrinkles in his face, his age, everything. There was no stone left unturned of what his enemies said about him.
Having said that, let's talk about his intellect. Clearly, he was laser beam focused on communicating ideas. He could sell an idea, and he was a man of considerable deep thought about personal viewpoints. He was not, as we have said, a nitpicker. And I don't know the extent to which he delegated authority. You can address that if you wish. But in terms of knowing where he wanted the ship of state to go, he had as clear a vision as anybody in recent memory who held that office. Yeah,
but I think his intellect is being undervaluated even now. When he was in the when he was on the circuit for GE in the 1950s, he had in his contract he wouldn't fly. He would only travel by train or by car. And that was because he had two bad experiences flying. Once flying back from Catalina in a very bad electrical storm, and another he was on a bond drive in a snowstorm, and the plane barely landed in Chicago. So he swore off flying for 20 years. But when he traveled by train, he didn't go to the club car and knock back drinks with the other traveling businessmen. He would get a private berth, and he would take in a steamer trunk full of books and magazines, and he would sit there and read. Lee Edwards, who is in many ways the official historian of the American conservative movement, interviewed Reagan out in California in 1966, just as he was getting ready to run for governor of California, and he was waiting there in Reagan's library, and it was filled with books, and he started taking them off the shelf. And there are books on economics, books on political philosophy, Benjamin Disraeli, Witness, this and that and the other. And he picked them up, and all of them were underlined and dog-eared. Reagan actually read every book and had taken notation. So this was an extremely scholarly man who sometimes worked at being underestimated, as Lou Cannon, his really great biographer, once told me.
Well, certainly there's nothing wrong with being underestimated.
It's a great political weapon.
It can absolutely be that. When the Alzheimer's set in, How did it manifest itself? We're told there were times when Reagan, in his very last years, would look at pictures of the White House and think that somehow he had a connection to that, but he wasn't sure what it was. What were some of the signs?
There are stories like that. He was told the Saturday before the November elections in 1994. And Mrs. Reagan had been told the day before by the doctors, and she, of course, was just distraught beyond belief. She called Fred Ryan, who was Reagan's former chief of staff, and told Fred, "I can't tell him by myself with the doctors. You've got to be here." So Fred went, and they told Reagan, and she was disheartened and sobbing, and Fred was equally upset, and the doctors were very morose, and Reagan doesn't, fall to his knees, doesn't cry, "Oh, God, why me?" anything. He goes over and he picks up a piece of paper and he sits down and he starts to write. And Fred says, "Mr. President, what are you doing?" And Reagan says, "Well, I guess I better tell the American people," which is absolutely remarkable that he's not thinking. He's told he has Alzheimer's, which is a death sentence. And yet his first thought is the American people and not himself, which I think it speaks volumes about his regard and appreciation for the people he led so long.
It certainly does, and that's something that you can't overlook. That is, as you note, the ultimate death sentence. We are not our pancreas or our liver or our limbs. We are that part of our brain that is our consciousness, and all these other things are the support system for that. And it's terrible, of course, if you lose a limb or a lung or what have you.
You can recover from those.
Recover from that because you are not gone.
Right.
But once your sense of who you are has disappeared from your brain,
then you lose your essence.
You essentially are dead. There may be a breathing, heart beating sac of protoplasm that's still there, but you are not.
Right. Yeah. Although I will say is that I went out to see him in 1996. I took my brother out to see him at Century City, and this was 2 years after the Alzheimer's was announced, 2.5 years after it had been diagnosed. And he was very good. He was jokey. We spent about 20 minutes with him. My brother asked him if he'd been to the ranch lately, and he took us over to show us a picture of a horse at the ranch, and he couldn't remember the word flooding. And a girl, the secretary there, said, "You mean flooding, Mr. President?" He says, "Yes, I do." Otherwise, he was fine. He was, as we were leaving, my brother says, "Mr. President, do you come to the office every day?" And Reagan says, "Not on the seventh day."
Fair enough. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. And one other note about the onset of the symptoms. My mother, again, in her dementia, I know some people get really nasty. My mother went from being a normal person into very childlike, very, very childlike, very gentle. There was about about a year period, but this time I had people in her house looking after her. And my mother she was losing it, but she still was aware of the fact that she was losing it. And when something like that would happen, when there was something she knew she should remember, but she couldn't, she would go off into the bathroom or some part of the house not occupied and prove to the world that, in fact, she had picked up a lot more of my father's vocabulary than anybody realized. She would just cuss like a sailor. Was there a period for Reagan when he was not only losing it, but was aware of the fact that he was losing it?
I think he was aware because the doctors had told him. But like I said, my own personal experience was that he couldn't remember a word. But I don't think he ever became angry. He was in his 80s. He'd outlived. He was born in 1911, and according to the actuarial tables, he should have been dead by 1961 anyway. And people who had been born in 1911, like Leo DeRocher and Lucille Ball, had long predeceased him. So he had already lived well beyond his expected years. So, and that was part because of his outlook, because of his physique, and because he took care of himself. So in some ways, Lou Cannon once told me maybe it was a curse that he took care of himself so long because he lived so long afterwards. Jean Kirkpatrick lived only a short time after she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Reagan lived 10 years and still did a lot of things in those 10 years. Going to the office, routine was important. He'd go for walks in the park. He'd shake children's hands, because they'd go up and they'd, hi, Mr. President, and he sometimes kicked a soccer ball in the local park with some children and things like that. But he'd go for he always liked dessert, and he always, so they'd go to lunch and he'd ask about dessert. And then one time they were driving by a man, fixing a flat tire, and he wanted his agents to stop so he could get out and help the man fix his tire. But so there was I never detected in any research I did, anybody I talked to, did he ever got down on himself or ever got angry with himself or lashed out at anybody. He simply accepted it. He was very much imbued with a Christian spirit, Christian forgiveness, and I think that came to his aid at the time he needed it most.
Back with more in a moment. Good to have you with us on the Jim Bohannon Show as we've looked back on a remarkable life, that of Ronald Reagan, who, of course, wound up with quite a second act, namely the presidency of the United States. Last act is Craig Shirley's book, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan, published by Thomas Nelson. Let's look at his impact on the presidential race this year. For one thing, I would have to think that if Reagan were alive and comprehending what was going on, that he would be sad at the ignoring of his 11th commandment.
Well, let's just say it's been bent and chipped a couple times, that's for sure. But it is no doubt, like you said before, that his shadow looms very greatly over the Republican Party field, even the Republican Party philosophy, although that also is bent and chipped to some degree. But what's interesting is that they hold the Republican presidential debate every 4 years at the Reagan Library. They don't hold it at the Nixon Library or the Bush Library. So I think that is significant in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. In terms of who Reagan might back this year, who is the most Reagan-esque in your view of the Republicans running?
Well, I would say all of them and none of them. Each of them carries with him some form of Reaganism. Ted Cruz for his passion, or Rand Paul for his intellectual libertarianism. And don't forget there was a time where Ronald Reagan described himself as a libertarian conservative. And in a way, Donald Trump, not stylistically, but in terms of at least his tactics. Reagan was always a revolutionary. He was always challenging the status quo, always challenging conventional wisdom, and he did so with his approach to the Soviet Union, with tax cuts, with many other issues. And he was always talking about the future, and that's why he was so popular with young voters. When he was reelected in 1984, he got 59% of the overall vote, but among voters under 30, he got 67%. His approval rating among voters under 30 was much higher than it was among all the citizenry when he left office in January of 1989. I think it was 72% when he left, but I think it was 77, 78% among voters under 30. He was always talking about the future, and he was always challenging the status quo. And so in a way, Donald Trump also is challenging the status quo, and he's the one who has adopted the Reagan slogan from 1980, let's make this country great again.
Yeah. Stay on the line. We'll speak off air. Again, if you know a Reagan fan out there, they should have this book. And if they're hard to shop for, well, the holidays are approaching, so you might want to consider Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan, published by Thomas Nelson, written by our guest Craig Shirley, the founder of Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs and a prolific writer in his own right beyond this latest book. I'm Jim Bohannon, and this is Westwood One.